Welcome back. Today's career video, it's a long one, isn't it? It's Dougie Gilmour, so go ahead and get yourself settled, get comfortable, and we're going to discuss a player who, well, he overcame the fact that he was a smaller player. And this is always one of those things that I find curious. When a player's really talented, puts up a ton of points, and scouts go, yeah, but he's like 5'9", so don't draft him. And that seemed to be the case because he was undrafted in 1981. So 1982, now he's an overager. And as I've mentioned in videos, whenever we're going into a draft, there's some really good overagers, but they're never going to be drafted that high because, well, he got skipped last year. Well, doesn't mean you were right. So he's drafted in 1982 by the St. Louis Blues with the 134th pick. Yeah. And we can look back at that and go, what a steal. But honestly, with almost any draft class, you could look and see a guy who slips because of his size that shouldn't have. Recent example, definitely not 134th overall, but I would use Cole Caulfield as an example. Everybody knew he was going to be a good goal scorer, but his size scared some teams off. Okie dokie. So 83-84, he makes his debut in the NHL, plays 80 games, 25 goals, 28 assists, 53 points. In the playoffs, 11 games, 2 goals, 9 assists, 11 points. Really solid playoff production. Good player, and for a St. Louis Blues team that's in the mix. St. Louis was a decent team in the mid to late 80s. They went on a couple of runs. They just weren't good enough to get past whoever came out of the Smythe division. It just wasn't fair. So, 84, 85, 78 games played, 21 goals, 36 assists, 57 points. Consistent production. In the playoffs, 3 games played, 1 goal, 1 assist, 2 points. The following year, 85, 86, again, very consistent production, 74 games, 25 goals, 28 assists, 53 points. In the playoffs, he broke through. 19 games, 9 goals, 12 assists, 21 points. And that was telling us what was to come and what kind of a player he was going to be, right? So going into the following season, I don't know if they expected his production to double, but it did. In 80 games played, 42 goals, which was 10th overall in the NHL that year. It's the only time he was top 10 in goal scoring in the National Hockey League. 63 assists, which is 5th overall, and his 105 points, also 5th overall in the National Hockey League. In the playoffs, in 6 games played, 2 goals, 2 assists, 4 points. He was 5th in Hart voting, and he was 6th in Selke voting. Very good two-way forward. When they initially brought him in, he's a third-line center. That's a good way for a guy to learn how to play at both ends of the ice. Although, from what I've read, from what I've seen, and from what I witnessed, that was never really a problem with his game, even in junior. So, 87-88, 72 games, 36 goals, 50 assists, 86 points. In the playoffs, 10 games, 3 goals, 14 assists, 17 points. Now, solid run, but he ends up being traded. So September the 6th, he was traded with Steve Bozek, Michael Dark, Mark Hunter in exchange for Mike Bullard and Craig Cox. This is a deal that Calgary wins and wins and wins and wins. And not just because Steve Bozek's in the deal. Solid two-way forward, more on the defensive side than anything else, but a player I was fond of. 88-89, he makes his debut in Calgary. 72 games, 26 goals, 59 assists, 85 points. So his point totals stay about the same. His goals drop off a bit. His assists go up. In the playoffs, 22 games, 11 goals, 11 assists, 22 points, and a Stanley Cup. So Dougie Gilmour wins a Stanley Cup. The only time in his career he would have one. It is to this date the only Stanley Cup won by the Calgary Flames. He was also 6th in Selke voting. So good, solid, two-way forward, well-respected, and all that fun stuff. 89-90, plays 78 games, 24 goals, 67 assists, which is 8th overall in the NHL. For 91 points in the playoffs, 6 games, 3 goals, 1 assist, 4 points. Do believe LA took him out that year in the first round. So for Calgary, they had the one and done. And it was frustrating to watch, right? Where Calgary was this dominant team mid to late 80s, and they finally get that Stanley Cup ring. And there were discussions of how many more are they going to win. And the answer was none. Which is odd because they had a very good team. But again, you had Edmonton in that division as well, and now Gretzky was with the Kings. So it was a tough division back then. 90-91, 78 games played, 20 goals, 61 assists, 81 points. In the playoffs, 7 games, 1 goal, 1 assist, 2 points. So the overall numbers down off a bit. The following season, he would end up being traded. And if there's ever a trade that's been talked about more than this one, I'm not sure what it is. I had a friend at the time who was a Flames fan who argued with me up and down that the Flames won this deal. And I still to this day, I got a good chuckle out of some of his arguments. I really understood that as a Flames fan, he desperately, really just clung to the idea that they'd won this deal. But he plays 38 games in Calgary, 11 goals, 27 assists, 38 points. They were at a contract impasse. They didn't want to give him what he wanted, and that was something both Alberta teams had going on. They were both shedding star players due to money. So he makes a trade demand. He's like, all right, I want out. And so they accommodated him in one of the biggest deals ever. I think it's still the biggest trade ever because it's 10 players. This is not draft picks. This is not futures. This is not prospects. This is 10 players. He is traded with Jamie McCowan, Kent Manderville, Rick Nattrass, and Rick Walmsley. So that's 4 guys going with him. Coming back to Calgary were Craig Berube, Alex Godinnik, Gary Lehman, Michel Petit, and Jeff Reese. If there's a trade where I feel like Toronto fleeced another team as badly as they fleeced Calgary, it escapes my mind right now. This was a win and a win and a win for the Toronto Maple Leafs. Because you're not only picking up Gilmour, you get McCowan, a good, solid defensive defenseman. Manderville was a depth forward. Nattrass, top 6 defenseman. Walmsley, solid backup goaltender. So with Toronto in 40 games, 15 goals, 34 assists, 49 points. He ends up 5th in Selke voting and 9th in Hart voting. Yeah, he was already showing signs that he could bring Toronto out of the doldrums, out of the Harold Ballard era, and make people respect this jersey again. And he did that in 92-93. 83 games played, 32 goals, 95 assists, which was 2nd overall in the NHL that year. 127 points, which is 7th overall. Ridiculous year, 92-93. Lots of points being scored. I look forward to someday in the near future when we see that kind of total again. It was such a fun time to watch hockey. In the playoffs, 21 games, 10 goals, 25 assists, 35 points. Just insane. He led the league in assists in the playoffs, but of course they lost in the conference final against LA in a series that to this day, Leaf fans are still pretty sensitive about, and understandably. Now, he wins the Selke that year, and he's 2nd in Hart voting. So, really, one of the top players in the league, and it just worked in Toronto. 93-94, what do you do for an encore? Well, 83 games, 27 goals, 84 assists, which is 2nd overall again. 111 points, which is 4th overall. In the playoffs, 18 games, 6 goals, 22 assists, 28 points. They lost in the conference final that year against Vancouver. But again, what a remarkable run. 63 points in the playoffs in 2 years for Dougie Gilmour. 2nd in Selke voting, 4th in Hart voting, and he was in the All-Star game for the 2nd straight year. So 92-93 and 93-94, those are 2 years he went to the All-Star game. Oddly enough, he never went to an All-Star game outside of that, so just bizarre. 94-95, lockout shortened season, 44 games, 10 goals, 23 assists, 33 points. In the playoffs, he had 6 assists in 7 games. So the totals drop off. Which, I mean, you can say red flag, but honestly, still Gilmour was a solid player. Those 2 years, though, if you can have 2 career years back-to-back, that's what he did. He set the bar so high, he wasn't going to reach that again, especially as Toronto as a team was dropping off too. 95-96, 81 games played, 32 goals, 40 assists, 72 points. So overall, the numbers are still good. We're also getting into the era where scoring is dropping in general around the National Hockey League. In the playoffs, a goal, 7 assists, 8 points in 6 games. And then guess what happens? Yeah, contract talks. Contract talks between the Leafs and Gilmour not going all that well. So Sundin has arrived in Toronto, and there's an idea of, okay, Sundin's gonna be the leader of this team. So Dougie Gilmour suddenly is on the trade block. He plays 61 games with Toronto, 15 goals, 45 assists, 60 points. He's scoring really well. February the 25th, he is traded with a 1999 third and Dave Ellett in exchange for Alan McCauley, Jason Smith, and Steve Sullivan. Steve Sullivan, really solid addition for Toronto. Sullivan, much like Gilmour, a guy who, on the smaller side, didn't really get the opportunities he would have if he'd been a bigger player, but he fought his way through that and still had a decent career. Now, with New Jersey, first off, it was weird to see Gilmour in a jersey that wasn't this one. Plays 20 games after that trade, 7 goals, 15 assists, 22 points. The combined 60 assists between Toronto and New Jersey puts him 6th on the overall list for the season. In the playoffs, 4 assists in 10 games. 97-98 plays 63 games with the Devils, 13 goals, 40 assists, 53 points. In the playoffs, he adds 5 goals, 2 assists for 7 points in 6 games. But the totals have dropped off. The highlight reel moves have dropped off. He gets signed July 28th that following summer as a unrestricted free agent with the Chicago Blackhawks. As weird as it looked to see him in New Jersey, it looked weirder to see him in Chicago. 72 games with Chicago that first year of 98-99, 16 goals, 40 assists, 56 points. So his role has diminished a bit at this point. And again, this is only 5 years removed from that 111-point season, and it shows how quickly things can change. You can be the go-to guy, the number one guy, and within a few years, your role's diminished. You might even be somewhere else. So that second year with the Chicago Blackhawks, 63 games, 22 goals, 34 assists, 56 points, and he's on the trade market again. March the 10th, he's traded with J.P. Dumont in exchange for Michael Grosek, and Buffalo loves this trade. After the trade, 11 games played with Buffalo, 3 goals, 14 assists, 17 points. I remember that because it felt like he was back. It felt like he had gone through New Jersey and Chicago, and he'd had good moments, but it felt like in Buffalo, it just really clicked, right? In the playoffs, he adds the 1 assist in 5 games. 2000-2001, 71 games played in Buffalo, but the numbers drop off precipitously here. 7 goals, 31 assists, 38 points. In the playoffs, he adds 2 goals, 4 assists for 6 points in 13 games, and his time is coming to an end. Now, what's interesting is he announces his retirement that summer. So his career's done. But the Montreal Canadiens, they're dealing with an issue with Saku Koivu that's going to keep him out. And so they talk him into playing. October 5th, he signs with the Montreal Canadiens. I can't prove that jersey felt like odd to him the first time he wore it after being a Maple Leaf, but I mean, it has to be a little bit odd, doesn't it? So that first year in Montreal, he plays 70 games, 10 goals, 31 assists, 41 points. And honestly, solid season. He's a depth player at this point. In the playoffs, he shows he can still play when the games are important. 12 games, 4 goals, 6 assists for 10 points. So in the playoffs, his production is solid. The following year, 2002-2003, plays 61 games, 11 goals, 19 assists, 31 points, or 30 points, I should say, and then he's traded. March the 11th, he returns to Toronto in exchange for a 2003 sixth-round pick. And there was this great emotional reaction to his return to Toronto and the thoughts of what he might be able to do for the Leafs. In 2003, it just wasn't meant to be. He only plays the one game because he was dealing with an injury. He only plays the one game, gets injured, and doesn't play another game. So it is an unceremonious ending for Gilmour here, but it's a great career. 1,474 games played, 450 goals, 964 assists, 1,414 points. In the playoffs, 182 games, 60 goals, 128 assists for 188 points. So he's above a point per game in the playoffs, a little bit below a point per game in the regular season. When the games are important, Gilmour shows up. 1987, he was part of that ridiculously talented 1987 Canada Cup team. At some point, I should do a video where I just put the roster up for the 1987 Canada Cup and say this wasn't fair to the rest of the world, because he was part of that Team Canada just juggernaut. And in 2011, he was inducted into the Hall of Fame. So for Doug Gilmour, it was a nice long career. Yeah, he got around 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different teams he played for. But I'm wearing Toronto because that's what we primarily remember him for, is that absolutely insane 2 years with Toronto. And before there was an Austin Matthews, there was a Dougie Gilmour. The difference being Dougie Gilmour was the passer first. Matthews is primarily known as being a goal scorer. So there you go. Let me know your thoughts in the comments section below as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through, you just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.